Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I want to welcome our speakers today, and I just have to say I have great affection for librarians. I mean, I think they saved me almost in every degree I have. So librarians are my saviors for all things except from fires. So we hope Julie is safe. So welcome today to Louise, Gillis, and Melissa Rothfus, and they're going to lead us through our presentation. There's more to research than research, which I agree, there's a lot more. But basically, they're going to talk to us about data management, author rights, open access, and more, which sounds very intriguing. So I look forward to your presentation. And do you guys have a preference if we hold questions till the end or if we ask throughout?
I think, well, we can do a couple things. If there's a sort of general question about clarity, feel free to interrupt so we can make sure that no one gets confused. But if you have like a more specific question, Louise and I are planning to have 2 breaks to answer questions. So Louise is going to talk first and then have a little Q&A, and then I'll have a turn and then have another little Q&A. You can also put things in the chat so as not to forget about them. We can moderate the chat for each other, and if we don't have, the ability to put the answer right in, we'll address it during the Q&A periods.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Sorry, and I just add to that if you prefer not to be recorded, you can hold your questions to the end and we'll stop the recording. And you could ask it then.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so everybody is on mute except for our speakers, and yeah, take it away.
Great. So thanks very much. And as Sherry introduced, my name is Louise Gillis, and I'm here together with Melissa Rothfus. So there's more to research than research. And what we're going to cover in today's session is a little bit about some of the library supports that are available to you for research data management, looking specifically at what we're doing in terms of an institutional strategy, something about data management plans, and a little bit about data deposit as well. I'll then hand things over and Melissa will address author rights, looking at how you can understand your author agreement, looking specifically at the JBI agreement, and then open access as well. So how to version your article, looking at what gold means and what green means. So let's get into research data management. And I will open with a very hard to read screenshot of the research data management guide. And the reason that I'm including this guide is so that you have a point at which you can access all things RDM when and where you need them. So the Research Data Management Guide is found on the library homepage, and I've dropped the link in the chat as well. And it's a space where you can go if you've got questions about anything to do with research data management. So if you're interested in learning more about what we're doing to develop a strategy, you can find that information here. If you're looking for how to get started with a data management plan or how to link through to the DMP assistant, that information is here as well. If you want to know about best practice for organizing your files, for file naming, you'll find that information here. And if you want to know more about complying with tri-agency requirements and sharing your data through a data repository, you'll find options for doing that compared here, as well as a link through to Scholar's Dalhousie Dataverse at Borealis, which is our institutionally supported data repository. So again, I've just provided the link in the chat. I'd recommend bookmarking it or tucking it away somewhere for easy reference. But backing up a minute, what even is research data management? So research data management is the practice of structuring, organizing, maintaining, and caring for research data. It is simple things like documenting your process, being consistent in the way that you name your files, taking care to ensure that you back up your work, Measures like this help ensure that your work has long-term value and keep you in compliance with funder, publisher, and institutional requirements. So, in terms of funder requirements, I'm going to take a minute to talk about one incredibly important funder, and that's the Tri-Agency. In, excuse me, in March 2021, the Tri-Agency released their research data management policy. And in it, they laid out 3 requirements. The first was that any institution receiving funding from the Tri-Agencies publish and make available an institutional strategy. And institutions were given until March 2023 to make this happen. Second requirement sits with the researcher. And this requirement is that any application that is submitted for funding be accompanied by a data management plan. Now, this is a phased-in requirement. So by and large, it is not yet implemented. However, initial opportunities were announced in spring of 2022. Now, the third requirement is that data be deposited. And again, this is to be a phased-in requirement. But what it means is that any funded project, the data that supports subsequent publication be made available through a trusted repository. That doesn't mean that it needs to be made openly available and that you need to share that data, but that it does need to be put into a space where the data is safe and secure. So if you'd like to read more about the Tri-Agencies, I've provided a link on the slide, and I'll also pop it in the chat.
I can put in the chat for you, Louise.
Melissa, I beat you to it.
You're very fast.
Thank you, though. Okay, so that's a little bit of background about the Tri-Agency and why universities are talking so much about research data management over the last few years. So let's take a look at each of those requirements laid out in the Tri-Agency in turn. So first, we'll look at the institutional strategy. And I want to assure you that there's some very good news here, and that is that Dalhousie is incredibly well positioned. We were the first institution Canada-wide to have an RDM strategy in place. I've provided a link here. Melissa, I haven't got one to pop in the chat, so if you want to put it in, you're more than welcome to do that. But it is available for anybody to access. There is pan-Canadian support provided through the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and instructional videos form part of that support. What is important to know about this document is that it is an evergreen document. So if you have a look through it and you don't see the support that you expect, if you think that there are sections that aren't particularly well defined, well articulated, we welcome that feedback and we can use it to make a better version. So absolutely have a read through, give us your feedback, tell us what you think. In terms of data management plans, that second requirement in the Tri-Agency policy, what we're talking about is a formal statement describing how research data will be managed and documented throughout a research project and the terms regarding the subsequent deposit of that data within a data repository for long-term management and preservation. So, data management plans are foundational to good research data management. They are a means of clarifying a path forward. They are a way of communicating clearly with your team, and they prevent problems down the road that could be expensive or costly to the overall research. So these are really big claims. But basically, by writing a plan, you are asked to think about and give real consideration to how you intend to collect your data, how you intend to document it and describe it, sort of contextualize it, how you intend to store it, what backups you will put in place to ensure that data isn't lost or overwritten, how and whether you think it needs to be preserved, whether you intend to share and what strategies you put in place to allow for that to happen, what roles and responsibilities various team members will have and how those responsibilities will be resourced. And finally, there's some consideration that needs to be given to ethical and legal compliance. So really, by putting a data management plan together, you're putting together a strategy for your research project. And if you take that process seriously, then you're positioning yourself really, really well for success. So in terms of developing a DMP, you can do that any which way you like. There is no prescription on how this needs to be done. If you would like to take your pad of paper, take a pen, have a brain dump, that's fine. That is one strategy. But you should know that there are resources that exist out there that can help facilitate the process and make it a lot easier. And one that we strongly recommend is the DMP Assistant. So this is a tool that is hosted by the University of Alberta Library and supported by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. It is a national tool. It's free and open for use. It's bilingual as well, so French, English. And what it allows you to do is put together a plan quite easily. So it provides prompts to researchers on a number of key data management issues, and each of those prompts is supported by best practice guidance and examples. So I've also included some notes here on the slide in front of us, so you can see that when you're working with this software, you can use it as you like. I'll stress again that it isn't prescriptive. What you can do is use it to best suit your needs. If there are questions that don't speak to your project, you can feel free to skip them and move on to those that do need to be addressed more fulsomely. Oh, before I move on to data repositories, the other thing that I wanted to say about the DMP Assistant, it is a tool, so you can use it as you like. Feel free to skip questions if they aren't relevant to your project. What you also might find, though, as you're working with it, you might think, oh, it would be really great if there was a question about this, or if when this question popped up, we were provided this piece of advice. If there are instances where you think that you would like to see a change in how the information is presented, you can speak to our team and we can develop custom guides for you. So custom templates for the DMP Assistant. So that's also an option. All right, and the third point that I wanted to hit was this data repositories piece. So the tri-agency, again, there are those three requirements: a DMP, a research data management strategy, a data management plan, and then data deposit. So I'd like to finally just take a look at data repositories and have a think about those. In terms of data deposit, this is a phased-in requirement, and at present, most funding opportunities do not require deposit, with some exceptions. And when you do come to deposit, there are various options available to you, one of which is publisher and disciplinary recommended repositories. So if you know of a repository and it suits your purposes, then continue on, carry on, and do as you do. If you're looking for options that are appropriate for your discipline, or then some of those are outlined in the research data management resource guide that I pointed to and provided the link for early in this presentation. You should also, though, know about the Dalhousie University Dataverse at Borealis, which is institutionally supported, it's multidisciplinary, and it handles most data sets. So The benefit of working with it is that you do have institutional support. You do have somebody looking over your deposits and giving you feedback, if desired, on how that data is described, how it's organized, and so on. So if that appeals to you, then you can set up a free account and you can get depositing there. If you're working with really large data sets, then I'd point out another option that is supported by the university and across the country, and that's the Federated Research Data Repository. And this would be appropriate if you were looking at a very large data set, and if the project has run its natural life and you don't anticipate editing the data any further, then this would be a really good option for you. And I would also mention that with the Federated Research Data Repository, if you are working with sensitive data, then there is a good project in the pipeline for sensitive data that would be hosted with the Federated Research Data Repository. Work in progress, but something that has us all very excited. Okay, and here's simply a screenshot of what Borealis, so the Dalhousie University Dataverse at Borealis looks like. Again, it's very small font, so it's not something I expect you to read, but it is something that I'd like you to recognize when you see, so it's just that little bit familiar. Okay, so that was what I wanted to cover with research data management. As Melissa mentioned, I'll take questions now if there's something that pops up, or we can handle those towards the end.
Don't be shy. All right. Well, if anything occurs to you, feel free to pop it in the chat, and or we can address it at the end as well. Oh, Elaine, you have a hand up?
Sorry, yeah, I'm being slow. Hi, Louise and Melissa. This is great, thank you. I'm really new to this data management, and happy to see these tools. And maybe this question is beyond your level of expertise, but it kind of just, it doesn't really make sense to me. And I guess it's the privacy issue. I'm mostly a qualitative researcher.
Right.
Would the expectation be that we put qualitative data in repositories as well? They can be very sensitive, I guess would be the term.
Yes, so now that's a great question. And really, it's going to depend. So in some instances, it will be appropriate to share qualitative data. But it is never appropriate to do anything that would contradict what arrangements you've made in your ethics application. So for example, if you were dealing with human subjects and you discussed in your ethics application how that data would be managed, then you need to do and honor what was written into that ethics application. What you could do if you were interested in sharing, or if your funder stipulated that the data needed to be shared, would be to share, in some instances, it would be appropriate to share de-identified data, but it would really be on a sort of case-by-case basis.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes it actually a little bit more clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
It
yeah.
will be
And
contact. It made more sense that this would be like larger data sets, and not necessarily to be used by others, but to have it available for ensuring like rigor and that the findings can be replicated.
Yes. Yeah. So there's going to be all kinds of exceptions. And you've hit on one of them where there's sensitivities. And it could be, human data, it could be proprietary, there could be legal concerns. So there's all kinds of reasons where it might not be appropriate to throw open the doors. But I would point out too that this isn't, it's not an open data policy. So there isn't any expectation that the data needs to be openly shared. What is required is that it be handled responsibly. And you know, you said that yourself, so that it's just that you are demonstrating some ability to replicate, to reproduce, that there's transparency in process. And if somebody were to question the validity of your findings, you could point to the research and say, here's everything, rather than saying, yeah, that's gone.
Yeah, Louise, I was just gonna jump in and just, you already mentioned it, but just to make crystal clear, because I think there is a lot of confusion about it. There is a difference between depositing the data in a repository and sharing the actual contents of the data. So one is just making the data about the data available. So letting people know that it's there, this data exists. In some cases, you don't want to share it openly, but you might share it in a controlled fashion with contracts, in some way of allowing other researchers to use that data if they request it, and if it's compliant with whatever ethics agreements you have in place. But putting it in a repository does not mean that it's just out there for everybody to use. It's not openly shared. It's just safe and potentially referenceable or reusable in a controlled fashion. So which applies to a lot of people in health, of course, because a lot of times we are working with human subjects. So can't just toss it all out there willy-nilly.
No.
Yeah, and it's just one more spot where you could have a potential data breach. So, you know, unless there was an explicit need to do it, I don't see why you would open up another possibility for a data breach unless you really needed to.
Yeah. I think I'm starting to repeat now, but you know, Melissa's point just did make me realize that probably when I present this material, I do really want to stress that this isn't an open data policy, but it is allowing your work. So any funded work, you're making a statement that this work has been funded essentially, and that there is data to support the conclusions. And then as appropriate, you're saying how that could be made available. So it might be through any different set of measures. But the sort of public facing component would be the metadata. So it would just be a description of what that data set was and the means in which it could be accessed, if at all.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for raising that.
Anybody else? Again, if anything occurs to you, feel free to ask at the end of the presentation as well, or toss it in the chat. So I think I've taken control of the slides. Let's see if this winds up working. For some reason, I have all sorts of extra stuff on my screen. Louise, does that look the way it's supposed to look still?
It does, yes.
Okay. Excellent. That's reassuring. Okay, good. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. I suppose we can imagine in the course of our process, you have completed your research, you've taken care of your data in a very responsible fashion, and now you're thinking a little bit more of what you're going to do with what you've written up about that project. So we're going to start by talking about author rights. So when you publish something, whether you're aware of it or not, you're entering into a publishing agreement. And I say whether you're aware of it or not, because sometimes in this digital age, publishers can be a little bit tricky about it. And I'm thinking about you, JBI, in particular. That's one that I've worked with quite a bit. I know I've worked with several of you. Publishing in JBI. And the thing is, when you submit to JBI, you enter into that author agreement before they've even accepted, before they've even looked at the manuscript. So you may not be aware that you're doing it, but indeed you are actually entering into a publishing agreement with the publisher, with the journal, before there's been any acceptance. So this could happen at any time in the process. It's not just at the very end, the way it used to be back in the pen and ink days. So a publishing agreement has been called many things. Sometimes it can be called a copyright transfer agreement, although I don't like to use that term because we're not always transferring copyright, and ideally we're not when we publish. But what the publishing agreement does is it sets out the terms between the publisher and the author or the creator of the work. And so there really is often a sense of impatience with these. Sometimes they have fine print. We're all busy. Nobody wants to read this stuff. We've got plenty of other more interesting things that we probably need to be reading at any given point, or at least so it might feel. So people tend not to look at these very carefully, but I would encourage you to do so if you don't already, because it lays out some really important rights for your work that you've labored so hard on and invested so much brain energy into. So one of the things it determines is who owns this work. And this is something that can really be mind-blowing, but you can secure the funding, you can do all the research, you can deal with that darn DMP that Louise was talking about, you can do all the investment into this work. But then you can find yourself with absolutely no right to it, no more right to it than I have or some guy off the street has as a result of this publishing agreement. So you're going to want to pay attention to that. If you're publishing open access, those terms will be in this publishing agreement. If there are limits and embargoes to sharing, that will be put in that agreement as well as any data related requirements that some journals have that will also be in the publishing agreement. So there's lots of really good, worthwhile stuff to know about in those agreements. Please do consider reading your next one. And let's talk about some of these issues a little bit more carefully here. So in traditional publishing, that is publishing in a journal that involves no open access or open access type licensing agreements, essentially you turn over copyright to the publisher, and that means they own the work and that you really have no more right to it than anybody else does. Some agreements allow the author to retain some privileges to share that work, and that's why I really do encourage you to read those things, because there can be some good stuff in there that's worth knowing. When it comes to open access, the copyright typically is retained by the authors, but published according to a licensing agreement with the publishers. And this usually means that authors can share and they can post as they like. So if you want to assign something you've written to your students, you can share it however you like. You can hand over the PDF. You can post it on Brightspace without any concerns. You could put it on websites, you could put it on social media, you can do whatever you want with it. You have complete flexibility. The license also allows others to do that. So other instructors can assign this to their students and share it freely with them without having to jump through any hoops or red tape or anything like that. Which isn't to say that there are no restrictions attached to it. At minimum, usually there's going to be attribution still required. So someone can share your article, but they still have to make it clear it's yours. They can't legally plagiarize it any more than they could with any other license arrangement. So because JBI is one that I'm familiar with, and some of you are familiar with as well, I just kind of grabbed this one as an example of the sorts of things that you might encounter with a license agreement. So this states very clearly that the JBI gets copyright, other rights to the work, such as patents, any other rights to process or procedure are retained by you, the author. But when it comes to text, figures, tables, or illustrations, that's not yours. That belongs to Wolters Kluwer, which is the publisher, and you need written permission to reuse it, even if you made it in the first place. It is no longer yours. And notice that citing is not enough. A citation is not going to cut the mustard here. You actually need written permission from the copyright holder, which it's kind of a kick in the teeth, but that's the way it works. Here is a little bit more, a larger excerpt from that publisher agreement. So this one, basically, they lay out all the terms at the top, and then in case you missed it, they repeat themselves with a little bit more detail below it. So essentially, it says the journal will permit the authors to deposit for display a final peer-reviewed manuscript. So this is called the postprint. So this is the version of the manuscript that has been modified as a result of peer review. It is the absolute final version that you, the author, touch, digitally before you send it off to the publisher. So it's saying you can take that postprint, and after 12 months have passed, you may share it on a personal website, an institutional repository, or your employer's intranet, subject to the following. And it basically says the same thing with more detail. As I said, it has to be the postprint, that final peer-reviewed manuscript. It cannot be the final version that's undergone copy editing or formatting. It can't have the page numbers, the final page numbers of the final version. It has to be just that postprint, and no exceptions to that. What else do they say? It has to be on one of those sites that they mentioned. So a repository, your personal website. It can't be on a commercial space. So that would include things like ResearchGate, academia.edu. Those are social media platforms. They are not repositories, and they are not often permitted in these sorts of situations for sharing. Again, there's that 12-month embargo period. You have to include a statement, and you have to provide a link to the final version as well. Those are pretty typical terms, so that's why I went ahead and used those as an example. And those are terms that you're going to want to look for when you publish, because even if you're publishing in a traditional journal, if you have the right, the privilege of sharing the postprint in a repository, that does count as open access. And so that means that if you have something that you want people to have access to, information that you want to have available, you can make it available openly this way. And so that can be a really happy compromise when you don't have the money to publish open access in a different way, but you do have something that will be of interest to decision makers or community partners or other people who might benefit from your research. You do have the ability to still put it in their hands if you are able to retain at least these minimal privileges to your work. So I would encourage you to look for that before you make final decisions about your publishing venue. Okay, so speaking of open access, let's talk a little bit more about it. So this is something that I didn't define right off the bat. I'm sure it's a term or a concept that you've encountered before, but just to make sure we're all on the same page here, when we're talking about open access, we're talking about publications that are made openly available, with the caveat that you do have to have an internet connection. So some people hail open access as this sort of great equalizer. There's still an equity issue when it comes to, the medium. You do have to have internet access. But with that said, it is openly available to anyone. And the publishers get away with that, and they stay in their profitable business by charging the authors for publishing their work. And this really rubs people the wrong way for many very valid reasons. One, it's money out of your pocket that you'd prefer to use to your research. And two, off the top of my head, it looks like vanity publishing. It looks, a little bit sketchy there. And so there has been a lot of resistance to open access for those reasons. So it is important to remember that valid open access publishers only publish work after they have undergone the same peer review process that is offered by traditional academic publishers, which means that the quality is the same. So it's going to be variable. So just like in a traditional set of journals, some are going to be more rigorous quality, held to a higher standard than others. So some are better than others, and so too with open access. Some are going to be better than others, but any valid open access publisher is still going to have that peer review process in place. So why publish open access. So the big one that I hope speaks to everybody is because it allows your work to be accessible by people all over the world who don't have an affiliation with a well-funded institutional library like we are privileged to have. So those subscriptions that we pay for in order to give everyone access to articles are extremely expensive. So not everyone throughout the world is able to pay for those. Not every library is able to pay for those. And there's also the fact that even here in Canada, we have people who might be very interested in your work who aren't affiliated with a university library. So I'm thinking of the provincial government. I used to work for NSHRF before it became Research Nova Scotia. I worked with the Department of Health and Wellness all the time, and they did not have access to evidence, even though they were supposed to be creating evidence-based policy, if that evidence was behind a paywall. So if you have work that might be potentially of interest to decision makers and policymakers, you want it to be open access so that people can use it. It can have that impact. And same with members of the community who might also have an interest in your work. And health has so many, research has so many very obvious, immediate implications for day-to-day living. I think very often health researchers should make their work openly available so people who need it can use it. So that's one I hope can speak to you. Another reason is that retaining copyright facilitates sharing and reuse. Again, you can use it for your students. You can send it to colleagues very easily and without worrying about breaking any rules, breaking any laws. A little bit more selfishly, well, not selfishly, but of more personal benefit is the fact that this broader exposure can lead to increased signs of impact, like citation counts. And last but not least, some funding agencies do require it. And I'm thinking of the tri-agencies again. So if you want to make your work open access, what are your options? Well, option number one is so-called the gold open access. So this is publishing with an open access journal. And when people think about open access, this is often what they're thinking of, publishing with an open access journal. Also, there is something called hybrid journals, which is a traditional journal that will let you make your particular article open access if you pay the processing charge to do that. So you have traditionally published paywalled articles existing side by side in the same issue with open access journals. We tend to not like that in the library world because we find that our vendors still charge us full price for that issue. Even if some of the articles inside it are open access. Mirror journals are open access versions of the traditional journal with the same title, editorial board, peer review policies, impact factors. It's just removing that double dipping issue that you get with the hybrid journals. And then finally, you have what's called green open access, which is what I've already kind of been talking about when I was talking about putting that post print in a repository. So that's when you take your traditionally published article, but you take the post print and you put it in a repository where it's openly available. And so essentially the content is available, just not the published version that's been copy edited and formatted and has those nice page numbers attached to it. So those are the main ways that we can describe access to open access options. So speaking of the tri-agency policy on open access, which is a few years older than the research data management one, I want to say 2015 off the top of my head. I could be wrong about that. 2015-ish, we can say. So in order to be compliant with the tri-agency policy on open access, as an author, you should publish any article that is the outcome of tri-agency funding in an open access journal or a hybrid journal, and or deposit that post print in an institutional repository like DALSpace within 12 months. So just to make this very clear, it is possible to be compliant with the tri-agency policy on open access without having to pay open access fees and without having to publish in an open access journal. You can publish in a traditional journal as long as you make your post print available in something like DAO space within 12 months. So that is compliant with the policy. A lot of people don't realize this, but it's true. I promise you, I wouldn't mislead you here. It is absolutely true. Post print, 12 months, DAO space, all free, open access, completely compliant with the tri-agency policy. You heard it here, possibly first, but that's, I think, worth knowing. So if you haven't published open access and you're just hoping no one will check, you don't have to, wake up at 2 in the morning worrying about that. Instead, just put it in DAO space and you're good to go, if you can. Okay, follow up with me. Yes, Elaine.
So many questions. When you were talking about the JBI copyright terms, I forget the.
Yeah, the author agreement.
Author agreement, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There was an embargo period of 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to kind of check to see how the journal lines up with the open access policy for CIHR. I'm seeing that as a key.
Right. So yeah, 12 months is the maximum CIHR allows you, and not coincidentally, JBI says 12 months. Yeah. So a lot of journals had to change their agreements when worldwide funders came up with similar policies like this. So it's not unusual to find that a traditional journal will allow you to be compliant with the tri-agency policy because they've got pressure from European funders and American funders as well to make sure that their authors can meet these qualifications. So yeah, so a lot of Elsevier journals, the embargo used to be 24 months. They had to bring them down to 12. So that they can be compliant. Yeah, so JBI, that allowance that you can put your post print in DAO space for 12 months means that you're complying with the tri-agency policy. Did you have more questions?
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good. All righty. If through happy circumstance, you happen to have some funds available and you do have your eye on a gold open access journal, we do have the ability to help you out in some cases here at the libraries. Now, we don't have a separate pot of money to give to people to pay their author or their article processing charges because we still have to pay for all those subscriptions to get access to those articles that are not open access. So we can't do two different things with one pot of money, except through some wily negotiations. So Dalhousie is a member of a national consortium here in Canada called CRKN, and I sometimes mix up the letters, but the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, yeah, CRKN. So CRKN does a lot of negotiating on behalf of many universities throughout Canada, and by sort of banding together in our negotiations, we are able to come up with some better contracts than we would individually. And so that includes bundling in some assistance for APCs with our subscriptions. And so as a result of kind of making that bundled negotiation, we can offer waivers or discounts on APCs. So what I have is a brief screen grab from a much larger table that's available on the open access libguide. And Louise, if you happen to be able to, I don't have the URL anywhere, but we'll put it in the chat if we can. I can do it later, or Louise can. Anyway, so we have this table available for you. I would check it always before submitting, or even better when you're thinking about deciding where to submit an article, because in some cases it's a 100% waiver. So for Cambridge University Press, for Sage, hybrid journals, it's 100%. In other cases, it's a discount, and it can be a less than generous 15%, and anywhere along the spectrum here. So, oh, thanks, Louise. So it's worth checking. We update that as soon as we get word of a new contract, and we actually have the wording in front of us. We copy and paste it right into that table to keep it as up to date and as accurate as possible. And you might see occasional reference to CRKN in the language there, because we do copy and paste it directly so that there is no room for error on our part when it comes to interpreting eligibility or instructions. If you have any questions about those waivers or those discounts, please let me know, because we can look at the contract more closely to address any questions. But for the most part, we I think provide you with what you need to know in order to pursue those. So be aware that we do have some options for saving some money there on those APCs if you are going to go the open access publishing route. And a plug for DALSpace. So DALSpace is our repository. It is a free place for you to deposit your stuff, and you can deposit it there with great reassurance that your work is going to be properly cared for in the long term. So as technology changes, I don't know about you, but somewhere in a desk or probably a box in my basement, I still have floppy disks from when I first started graduate school. I have no means of actually reading those disks, and I probably should throw them out. But my point is that technology changes rapidly, and so what you have safely stored now may not be accessible in 10 years when you have long since thrown out your last zip drive or whatever you were using to store your data. So having DALSpace means that someone else is taking care of that for you. So they're making sure that your work continues to be discoverable. You can search for something in Google and get the results from DALSpace, that it will continue to be accessible into the long term, and that it's going to be permanently cared for in the course of time as technology changes. And in DALSpace, you can put a wide range of materials. You can put abstracts, you can put preprints, you can put presentations. So, you know, a PowerPoint presentation, you can put posters, you can put articles, you can put chapters, you can put all sorts of things. I will note for the preprints, and this is something that I learned from experience, is that some of you, for good reason, because your publisher like JBI requires it, share preprints but have to take them down later. DALSpace is not a good place to do that. We can take things down. We just really don't like to, because from a librarian's point of view, once you've posted something and it's out there and people can cite it, you don't want to take it down again, because someone who's tracing information through citations is going to run into a dead end. Once it's there, we want it to stay there. So we don't like to take things down from DALSpace. So I wouldn't suggest using that as just a temporary place to make something like a preprint available. So something more like a OSF, the Open Science Framework, is that what it stands for, is a better tool for that, and that's what I know a lot of you use. And I've encouraged people to use DALSpace, but I should add the caveat, only if you plan on leaving it up there would DALSpace be an appropriate tool for that. Otherwise, it is something that is supported here at Dalhousie that we offer to you, again, for free. And again, it is a means by which you can be compliant with the tri-agency policy on open access. So be sure to take advantage of this resource, and we're happy to help you if you have any questions about doing exactly that. Again, here's a screen grab from about there's a couple pages here to help you get familiar with DALSpace and how it works. And this comes from the open access guide that has information on a lot of the things that I've been talking about today. So the APCs, green open access, and so on. And so again, I put the URLs here, and I think these actually work. They might actually be live if we don't have to put them in the chat, but there is a guide for open access, and there's a guide for scholarly communications that has tabs on other related issues and topics as well. And so I put contact information for Louise and I there on the final slide. Are there any other questions that anybody has in the time that remains? And I guess actually I will stop. So I will stop recording.